Chapter 34. The end of second year. 4 months, Albus. 4 months. And you have got nowhere. It's nearly the middle of April, for crying out loud, Nicholas shouted, as Albus glared at him. Every weekend I come up here to see if you have made some sort of miraculous breakthrough in finding the other Horcruxes, but you haven't. You have found nothing. I have found that Tom Riddle framed Hagrid for the attacks 50 years ago, and I have righted that wrong with the Ministry. Hagrid can now have a wand, and I have been teaching him spells. Albus shouted angrily. Well, I am very happy for Hagrid, I really am, but a child's life is at stake here. Ron Weasley is a powder keg waiting to explode at any moment, Nicholas cried, pounding a fist on the headmaster's desk. It had been a very irritating 4 months. Salazar and Godric had broken into Albus's office every single night for a month in order to search for the diary, but they had no luck. Dobby came to Salazar and offered to secretly watch the headmaster and see where he hid it, but he could only watch for so long before he was called back to the Malfoys' home. After Dobby's wonderful idea, Godric Self-Peaky had a little more luck and actually saw Albus studying the diary, but as soon as Albus put it away, Peaky immediately forgot where it was hidden. That meant Albus was hiding the blasted thing under a Fidelius charm. Nicholas kicked himself and said that it was probably he that gave the idiot headmaster the idea, when last year he told Albus that hiding the stone under a Fidelius in his office would have been smarter. Merlin set to work trying to figure out a way to break the Fidelius, but the charm was designed the way it was for a reason, and he had no such luck. They had even went as far as to have Peaky let them know when Albus was studying it, and then Godric would sip Polyjuice Potion and turn into random students in order to gain entrance into his office, but that didn't work either. Every time Godric would knock on the door or suddenly burst through it, Albus would put the diary away quickly before Godric could even get a stunning spell off. And that was saying something, seeing as Godric was as fast as he was. They tried hiding under a disillusionment charm so that they could outright stun him when he brought the diary out, but the old headmaster's portraits alerted Albus that something was off in the room. They tried that same trick again, thinking maybe it was a fluke, only for the same results to happen. They would have had Peaky stun him, but they didn't want Albus to get mad and press charges against the elf, who would have been killed for attacking the wizard. It wouldn't have been hard for Albus to guess that an elf was somehow involved, or whose elf it was that attacked him after an investigation was carried out, seeing as there was only 4 people actively trying to get it. They even tried the Confundus charm, to no avail. Albus was just too strong a wizard and a Confundus wouldn't work on him. They knew obliviating the old fool wouldn't work either, because then the knowledge of where the diary was hidden would be lost forever. Short of them killing Albus and blowing up his office until the diary flew out of its hiding spot, they were stuck. Needless to say, Albus had outsmarted them all, which was why Nicholas was in a very bad mood at the moment. Mr. Weasley has been fine. I check up on him regularly, and he has had no relapses, Albus said calmly, looking at Nicholas with an amused expression. Nicholas gritted his teeth. Albus, he said calmly, trying to regain his composure. The diary needs to be destroyed. Let it go. No, Nicholas, I won't. I'm not done combing through it yet. I've seen some his memories in the diary, and I have picked up some clues. What clues? Nicholas asked with mild curiosity. Ones I'm not comfortable sharing with you at this time, Albus replied. Why? Because I know that what you learn you will share with Harry. I told you months ago what he said about Voldemort. I don't trust Harry, and I have already told Arthur and Molly what I suspect. Nicholas burst out laughing. Oh yes, now I remember. You tried to tell us that Harry admired Voldemort and that he wanted to be like him. You forgot one important detail though. Nilrem can understand Parseltongue too, and he was in here at that moment. Both Harry and Nilrem had a good laugh over the fact you are trying to turn us and the Weasleys against him. Haven't you noticed that it hasn't worked? Albus furrowed his brow for a moment, and it seemed to Nicholas that the headmaster had actually forgotten that bit of information, but then Albus scowled. I don't trust that man. I think he and Harry are both dark wizards. He graduated from Durmstrang. Nicholas rolled his eyes. Your paranoia is growing worse, Albus. Not everyone who disagrees with you is a dark wizard. I still don't trust Harry or that man, Albus declared as he leaned back in his chair. I fully believe that Harry has been heavily influenced by the dark families in Slytherin, and I fully believe what I heard him say that day. Nicholas started at him in stunned disbelief and slowly shook his head. You really have lost it, he said with a half chuckle, half sigh. Well, I can see that trying to talk to you is going to go nowhere. Good luck in dealing with Ron Weasley when Riddle has figured out what he wants to do. I hope no one gets hurt or dies in the process, and if they do, remember that we all tried to warn you. Nicholas stood up and left at that point. There was no point in arguing with the man anymore, but what worried him the most was, did Albus really believe what he was spouting about Salazar, or was this all intentional in order to ruin his reputation as the boy who lived? It was lunchtime on Wednesday, 2 weeks after Nicholas had spoken with Albus, and Salazar and Blaise had just sat down in their normal seats at the Slytherin table. They looked up when Hermione and Neville came bustling over towards them. What's wrong? Salazar asked, looking at them with concern. What? Hermione asked, somewhat distracted. Oh, nothing. Nothing, she continued, then she began staring off into space. Salazar and Blaise looked at Neville curiously, but the lad started chuckling. We just came from Transfiguration and Professor McGonagall told us that we need to start thinking about what electives we want to take for next year. We can take 2 or more classes and they are, Ancient Runes, Care of Magical Creatures, Divination, Mull Studies, and Arithmancy. Neville answered as he began to make a sandwich for himself. Oh, well, that explains Hermione's spacey look, Blaise said with a wave of his hand, and Salazar began chuckling. I want to take them all, she announced suddenly. Salazar raised a single eyebrow and cast a glance in her direction. May I make a suggestion? Hermione seemed to snap out of her daze, and finally looked at him properly. Of course, Harry. Don't do that. Don't do what? She asked. Don't take them all, he answered, looking up from his plate. The workload will overwhelm you tremendously. I have no doubt that you could pull it off, but trust me, Hermione. You won't get a lot of sleep, you will be tired, stressed, and worried about failing because you won't be able to properly pay attention. My advice is to think about which classes are the most important to you and take those. She seemed a little taken back by the suggestion, but she nodded. Which classes do you suggest? That question seemed to cause Neville and Blaise to sit up and pay closer attention to the conversation. I would personally take Runes, Care of Magical Creatures, and maybe Arithmancy, but that's just me. The rest, in my opinion, are a waste of time. Why do you say that? Hermione asked, looking at him and furrowing her brow. Well, think about. Mull Studies is a waste of time for you because you are a Mull born, therefore it's not needed. Divination is a load of crap because it deals with predicting the future, and very few people in the world are true seers. Divination is kind of like Parseltongue in that aspect. If you're not born with a seer's gift, then you won't be able to predict the future no matter how hard you try. He answered, taking a sip of his pumpkin juice. Okay, she said slowly. I understand about divination, but I think studying Mulls from a wizarding perspective would be fascinating. Then I would suggest reading wizarding books about Mulls, he said simply, which caused her to give him an exasperated look. I wouldn't take Runes, Neville said, scrunching up his face. It's just memorizing a bunch of symbols and translating them into words. It is, Salazar admitted with a slight nod. But runes are fascinating because you can use them to cast spells and create wards. It's how the ancient witches and wizards did their magic before wands came along. Really? The children said together. Salazar nodded, reached into his bag, and pulled out a blank sheet of parchment and a quill. Now normally, he said, as he began to draw symbols on the parchment, you would carve runes on a piece of wood or stone, but for this purpose, I can use the parchment. He continued to carefully draw the symbols one on top of the other until all the lines blended together and you couldn't really tell them apart. Then he stood up, walked away from the table a little ways, bent down, and placed his hand on top of it. He muttered an incantation, then backed away quickly. Suddenly, the parchment began to glow a bright golden yellow color, and almost instantly, a green and silver column of flame burst straight up. It was about waist high, and everyone in the great hall turned to stare at it with wide eyes. "Potter!" Severus yelled, as he stood up at the head table and made his way towards Salazar. Salazar intercepted him and pushed Severus backwards. In the same moment the top of the column of fire burst open. It began emitting tiny sparks that grew into small green and silver fiery butterflies. Salazar summoned 2 empty potion vials from his bag, and enlarged them until they were the size of large jars. Then he waited patiently for the flame to die down. The butterflies hovered over the spot where the flame and parchment used to be, and Salazar began hand-picking butterflies out of the air. He let them flutter through his fingers and around his hair, before placing a few in the 2 jars. Salazar turned to face Severus, who was glowering at him. "I'm sorry I had to push you away, Professor. I just didn't want you to end up with a face full of butterflies." Several people at the Hufflepuff table started laughing, but Severus silenced them all with a glare. Then he sneered at Salazar, before making his way back up to the head table. Salazar chuckled lightly before turning his attention to Hermione. "Please, forgive me for the color combination," he said, as he bowed low at the waist and handed her one of the jars. "I tend to favor green and silver colors," he added with a grin. She giggled as she took hold of the jar. "They are beautiful, Harry. Thank you. Who's the other for?" "Luna," he said simply, motioning towards the blonde Ravenclaw who was staring at the other butterflies in fascination. He presented the other jar to Luna in the same manner, and she smiled brightly at him as she took it. "Thank you, Harry," she said in a dreamy voice. "Perhaps they can help keep your wax purts away," he said with a wink. She giggled lightly. "Perhaps, but I will let you know if they do or not," she said. Then she gave him a light hug before sitting back down at the Ravenclaw table. She showed them to Colin, who began mock glaring at Salazar, but then the lad laughed and took a picture of Luna holding up her jar full of green and silver butterflies. Salazar chuckled, sat back down in his seat at the Slytherin table, and grinned at his friends. "And that," he said, gesturing to Hermione's jar, "is an example of what you can do with runes." "I'm definitely taking runes," Blaise said as he grinned at Salazar. "So am I," Neville and Hermione echoed. "What are you going to do with the rest of the butterflies?" Godric asked, as he made his way towards them. He looked a little angry and Salazar looked at him curiously because of it, but Godric waved him off. Salazar got the hint knowing Godric would tell him later, but then he grinned wickedly. He vanished all but one of the butterflies, and sent it over towards the Gryffindor table. Everyone watched as it innocently fluttered down the length of the table and came to a stop in front of Fred and George, who looked at it rather oddly. "Harry, Fred and I appreciate the gesture, but I don't think we are all that into butterflies. Maybe you should." "Ah!" Several people at the Gryffindor table screamed loudly when the butterfly exploded and morphed into an ugly snake-faced creature. Fred, George, and their friend Lee Jordan slipped out of their seats and landed hard on the floor on their bums. Godric, along with others in the Great Hall, burst out laughing as Salazar jumped up from his seat and began dancing a little jig around the end of his table. Fred, George, and Lee stood up, brushed themselves off, and grinned in Salazar's direction. "This isn't over, Potter," George exclaimed with a grin, as Fred and Lee began snickering. "That was just payback for turning our common room red and gold," Salazar shouted. "And I know you had help from a certain Gryffindor in Slytherin robes." Godric's burst out laughing, but Blaise looked at Godric and starting whopping him over the head with his napkin. "That was you," he cried, as Godric half-heartedly tried to wave him off. "Weasley!" Severus shouted. 10 points from Gryffindor for defacing the Slytherin common room. "Ruffin and Potter, see me after lunch." No one paid any attention to him though. Everyone, including some professors, was too busy giggling, laughing, snorting, or a combination of the three. Remus finally got himself under control and stood up, while still trying to hold back a few snickers. "Messrs. Weasley, 10 points to Gryffindor for an excellent display of color-changing charms." His announcement made all of the Gryffindors in the Great Hall began cheering, but Severus glared at him and stalked out of the Great Hall. Salazar chuckled as he watched Severus go, and knew the man was trying to escape so that he could laugh properly at the situation. Salazar glanced up at the head table and noticed that Minerva and Poppy, along with Professors Sprout and Flitwick, were laughing merrily. The others were also giggling and talking among themselves, but Albus looked torn. On one hand, it looked like he wanted to laugh, but on the other, he wanted to frown at Harry. Salazar just shook his head, and turned his attention towards Godric and the children. "Anyway, as I was saying before I got a little sidetracked, I think I'm going to take runes and care of magical creatures." "Why not arithmancy?" Hermione asked. "Well, in a sense, it is another form of divination, except you use numbers and patterns instead of the inner eye. It's also a lot more accurate than divination," he explained. "I personally don't care for it though, but don't let that cloud your own judgment." Hermione mumbled, as she swallowed her food. "In that case, I think I will do care of magical creatures, runes, and arithmancy. I think you're right about mole studies. I can look into that at my own pace, and now that I think about it, I don't think I will like divination all that much." "You're a logical person, Hermione," Godric said with a nod. "Divination involves a lot of interpretations, guessing, and in some cases, making stuff up." "Yeah," she said, scrunching up her face. "I don't think I would like that. I like facts and absolutes, which is why arithmancy sounds more for me because it deals with numbers and patterns. I'll give it a try, and if I don't like it, I can drop the class before next year is over." "A wise choice," Salazar said with a nod. "What about you two?" he asked, looking at Blaise and Neville. "I'm with Hermione on this one," Blaise said, clearing his throat. "Care of magical creatures, runes, and arithmancy. As for me, I think I'll go with mole studies, runes, and care of magical creatures," Neville said. "Though I think I'll be terrified of creatures," he laughed. "Why mole studies?" Godric asked curiously. "I don't know really," Neville said with a shrug. "I want to know about them, and how they go about doing things. All I know about moles is what you two say about them," he continued, as he pointed towards Salazar and Hermione. "They just sound interesting." "Well, I think those are great choices personally," Godric said with a grin. "But I think Harry and I should head off to see what Snape wanted. He may get angry if we keep him waiting." "I agree," Salazar said, standing up. "I'll see you all later." The children nodded, but Godric and Salazar missed the knowing grins that they all shared. However, when Salazar and Godric disappeared out of the Great Hall, Albus stood up and made his way down to Hermione, Blaise, and Neville. "Albus is at it again," Severus said, once Salazar had closed the door to his office. "He has convinced all, except Sprout and Flitwick, that you are some kind of Dark Lord waiting to be set free. Minerva, Poppy, and Lupin are doing their best to convince the other professors otherwise, but they are losing. Salazar chuckled and shook his head. I don't care really. You, Poppy, Minerva, and Remus are the important ones. Everyone else can follow Albus blindly, but eventually they will realize that he is lying. He can try and trash me all he wants. In the end, I'll prove him wrong. I got to say, Sprout and Flitwick are smart, Godric said. Perhaps they are on our side because of what Albus tried to do last year. That's exactly it, Severus said, pointing at him. They told Minerva they won't believe it until they see it for themselves. They also told her that what they see is a nice young man who helps his peers and is friendly towards everyone. Albus told them all you are deceiving them, just like the Dark Lord did when he was at school, and he told them to be careful. Well, I'll just have to prove to everyone that Albus is a balmy old fool. It shouldn't be too hard. Godric snorted. Indeed, but we have another, more pressing matter to attend to. Does it deal with why you were angry when you came to lunch late? Salazar asked curiously. It does. Godric nodded. And it involves Ron. I was coming out of history when I was basically assaulted by some older Gryffindors, he said with a scowl. They were calling me names, roughing me up a bit, and knocked my books and things out of my hands and spread them all over the corridor. Ron and his friends, Seamus and Dean, came around the corner at that moment, and Ron saw me picking up my diary. He said, taking the diary out of his pocket and laying on Severus's desk. I saw it happen, Salazar. In that moment, he saw my diary and I knew what he was thinking. His face got all red, and it was like watching a slow-motion transformation take over him, but the only thing is, there was no glow. I think it has happened though, he said gravely, and Severus and Salazar's eyes widened knowingly. He thinks your diary is his, or rather, Riddle's, Severus whispered, as he stared at Godric's. I think so, Godric said, casting a worried glance at both men. We knew this could happen. I've been trying to remain calm because I didn't want to worry the children, but I honestly don't know what to do. What did Ron do? Salazar asked. He left without a word, but he was scowling and muttering under his breath. I tried to pick up my things as quickly as I could, but by the time I could go after him, he had disappeared. Godric answered, running a hand through his hair. All right, Salazar said with a sigh. Severus, alert Minerva, Poppy, and Remus. Tell Remus to contact Sirius so he can tell Nicholas and Merlin. Godric, alert the twins and Percy, and tell the twins to watch his every move on the map. Severus, the twins have potions for their last class, correct? Yes, he answered with a nod. Okay Godric, tell the twins to fake sick during potions, and to go to the hospital wing. That way they can keep a closer eye on Ron. I'll warn Blaise, Hermione, and Neville in defense, which we have next, so Ron should be in there, to keep a watch on him in their other classes for the rest of the day. I'll say he is starting to look off again or something. Godric and Severus nodded, then they all headed out the door. During defense, Hermione, Blaise, and Neville had told Salazar that the headmaster had approached them after he and Godric left the Great Hall. Apparently Albus tried to convince them that he was a dark wizard, and they should pick their friends more carefully, while also telling them to stay away from Harry. Hermione assured Salazar that they didn't believe a word the headmaster said. Neville said that Albus had gone mad, Blaise said he had no business trying to run their lives, but Salazar smirked when Hermione said that Albus needed mind his own business. With eyes on Ron in one form or another, the rest of the day passed smoothly, even though everyone was on pins and needles waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nicholas showed up again around dinner, and after letting everyone know that Molly and Arthur had been contacted, proceeded to try and encourage Albus to hand him the diary. With no luck. Not only did Albus not believe Nicholas, but he blatantly told Nicholas that he didn't trust him to handle the situation properly. Nicholas called Albus an idiot to his face and once again told the headmaster that he was going to get someone killed. Albus all but threw Nicholas out of his office after that. It was Thursday morning when Ron set Emeralda loose again. She found Severus, and Severus had to go get Salazar out of herbology. Emeralda told them that she was supposed to kill Gordy Ruffin for stealing the diary. It was then they knew Ron was truly possessed again. Salazar told Severus to tell Minerva what happened, so that she could alert the headmaster. They figured this was the better thing to do, seeing as Harry would never go to Severus with a problem. Later that night at dinner, the twins and Percy tried to talk to, and reason with Ron, but the boy cursed them in the middle of the Great Hall. He didn't use any unforgivables, but Percy's arm broke when Ron hit him with a bone-breaking curse, and then he somehow vanished both Fred and George's leg bones. Albus put a stop to it by letting off several loud blasts from his wand, and Ron ran out of the Great Hall. Albus sent all the students to their common rooms, and told them to stay there. Percy, Fred, and George were taken by Minerva and Poppy to the hospital wing, and Ginny went along with them as a precaution. "You need to sit down before you wear a hole in the floor," Godric said, eyeing Salazar as he paced back and forth across the dorm room. "Quiet, I'm trying to think," Salazar snapped, causing Godric to roll his eyes. It had been 15 minutes since the events in the Great Hall. Albus had locked down the castle and sealed off all the common rooms so no one could get out of them, but Salazar and Godric could easily bypass that with Nahum. They had sent a quick message, via Nahum, to Merlin and Nicholas, and the two wizards were now waiting in Godric's house. Blaise was sitting in the dorm room with them and he was watching both the founders carefully, while Nahum sat on the end of Salazar's bed. "What are we going to do?" Godric asked. Salazar looked from Godric to Blaise, but shook his head. "I'm not sure," Salazar answered. Blaise sighed loudly and shook his head. "Just out with it. Are you waiting for Snape or McGonagall to send you a sign?" "Why would we do that?" Godric asked, looking a bit startled. Blaise rolled his eyes. "Look, this probably isn't the best time in the world to tell you both this, but we, meaning Hermione, Neville, and I, already know." "Know what?" Salazar asked, narrowing his eyes at the lad. "Know who you really are," Blaise answered somewhat nervously. "We didn't want to say anything because we didn't want you to worry. We know you are Salazar Slytherin and Godric Gryffindor, but we don't know much beyond that. Because of your boggart, Hermione thinks that you are protecting the real Harry Potter and his parents," he said, looking at Salazar. "We don't how or why you have lived this long, nor do we know how or why you are protecting them, if that is what you are doing. Like I said, we don't know much beyond who you really are. We also know that Fred, George, McGonagall, Snape, Lupin, and Madame Pomfrey know who you are as well. Oh, we also know that Nolram spelled backwards is Merlin, but we don't know if that means that man is really the Merlin. Neville and I are a bit iffy on that. Please don't worry though, we haven't told anyone what we suspect." Godric and Salazar stared at Blaise in shock for several long seconds, until Godric suddenly burst out laughing. "Hermione really is the brightest witch of her age," he said with a snort. "Professors Dumbledore, Snape, and Lupin, please report to the second-floor corridor now." Minerva's slightly panicked voice rang out through the castle, and all three of them looked up towards the ceiling. "I guess that is your cue," Blaise said with a grin. "We will talk about this later," Salazar said sternly, causing Blaise's grin to vanish. "All right," he said, giving them both a worrying glance. Nahum took flight and Godric and Salazar grabbed a hold of his tail so that he could transport them to the second floor. Albus glared at them as Nahum dropped them off and disappeared again, only to reappear a few moments later with Nicholas and Merlin in tow. "I locked down this castle for a reason," he shouted, turning red in the face. "Harry, Mr. Ruffin, I demand you go back to the Slytherin common room this instant." None of them were listening to him though, because they were too busy staring at the wall. "As you can all see, Mr. Weasley has left another message. Minerva said, pointing to the words hastily written in blue paint. Give me back what is mine, or they will die. Who will die? Merlin asked. Minerva took a deep breath. Apparently Miss Granger and Mr. Longbottom never made it to Gryffindor Tower along with everyone else. I found their wands laying in the fourth-floor corridor, she said, holding them up. I believe Mr. Weasley attacked them somehow and took them into the chamber, she added, casting a glance at Salazar. Mr. Potter, I do hope you know where that is. I do. Emeralda told me, he answered, causing Albus to glare at him. Albus, the diary! Nicholas shouted, glaring at the headmaster. I told you this could happen. You didn't listen. If those children, including Mr. Weasley, are hurt Mr. Dumbledore, I assure you whatever their injuries are, yours will be tenfold. Give us the diary so it can be destroyed. If you don't, I will kill you where you stand, thereby negating the fidelius you have placed it under. Merlin said with controlled rage, as a fierce wind suddenly sprang up in the corridor. Albus paled drastically, but sighed and nodded before pulling the diary from his pocket. Here, he said with a glare, tossing it to Nicholas. As soon as Nicholas had it in his hands, Godric stunned Albus. No one saw the spell, but they knew he had been hit when Albus crumpled to the ground. That way he can't follow us, Godric said gruffly. We don't need him mucking up anything down there. I agree, Salazar said with a nod. Minerva, I must ask you all to stay here. Say we stunned you as well, but give us 5 minutes before you revive him. I'm not worried about the children being hurt by Emeralda, but they don't know she is a basilisk and they won't know to not look into her eyes. Tell Poppy to have the mandrake draft ready just in case. All right, she said with a nod. But you need to know that I checked with the twins in the hospital wing to confirm what I said. Something is off when they looked at the map. All 3 of the children are laying in the middle of the chamber, and they appear to not be moving. However, the name Tom Riddle has suddenly appeared down there. Salazar sighed heavily and nodded. Very well. I don't want to startle him by suddenly appearing with Nahum, so we will go down the traditional way. Remember, give us 5 minutes. They all nodded and watched as Salazar and the others disappeared into the girls' restroom. Rebuilding the stairs in the pipe took a lot less time with the 4 of them working together, so in no time at all, they found themselves standing outside the door to the chamber. You all should disillusion yourselves. That way he thinks I'm alone and not a threat, Salazar whispered. A wise suggestion, Merlin said, as they all disappeared from view. Salazar opened the chamber door, and they all quickly made their way towards the front. Emeralda was nowhere to be seen, but Hermione and Neville were tied up and sitting in front of the statue, and Ron was laying on the floor and he appeared to be knocked out. Riddle was standing a few feet from them, and he glared at Salazar as he approached. Relief beyond measure filled Salazar when Hermione turned her head towards the sound of his approaching footsteps. Harry! She cried, and she and Neville began struggling against their binds. I told you he would find us, Neville shouted, as he glared at the semi-solid form of Riddle. You didn't believe me, and said that Harry didn't know where the chamber was. Looks like you've been outsmarted again. Riddle glared at Neville before turning his attention to Salazar, who was checking on Ron. What did you do to him? He's ice cold, Salazar said, trying to appear meek and unthreatening. Ron Weasley is dying, Potter. I am a memory and have embedded myself into him. This pathetic little boy has given my diary so much of his soul because of his hate and anger, that I was able to overtake him very easily. So much so, that I could actively use his own magic to make him attack his family and friends. That is why he remembered everything I made him do. I couldn't have asked for a better tool, Riddle said smugly. He will be dead soon, and I will return, very much alive, he said coldly. Hermione, surprisingly, burst out laughing. You have no idea who you are dealing with, Voldemort, she sneered. No idea at all. That sneer would have made Severus proud. Salazar thought as he tried to hold back an amused smirk. Bloody Gryffindors. Shut up, you filthy little mudblood. Riddle shouted. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and this time he is standing in my territory. Salazar Slytherin built this chamber, and I, Lord Voldemort, am a direct descendant of Slytherin himself. This puny little boy, who claims to be the heir of that filthy mole-loving Godric Gryffindor, has no chance of defeating me here. Riddle's rant only caused Neville and Hermione to burst out laughing again, and Salazar watched in amusement as Riddle grew more and more angry. He almost burst out laughing himself when Godric snorted behind him. Riddle didn't seem to hear it though and kept on glaring at Hermione and Neville, who were still chuckling. What say you, Potter? Think you can defeat me here? Where is my diary? Tell me, or I will kill them. Riddle shouted, pulling out a wand that looked like Ron's. The wand suddenly flew out of Riddle's hand and skittered across the floor. Upon seeing that, Hermione and Neville once again started laughing. Riddle stared at his hand in shock and looked around trying to see if anyone else was around. I should have known. Hermione said with a giggle. Yeah, Harry never goes anywhere without the Gryffindor in Slytherin robes. Neville said with a happy grin. Indeed I don't. Salazar admitted with a chuckle. Though in my defense he seems to follow me around, not the other way around. Ouch. Why did you hit me with a stinging jinx? Salazar suddenly cried, causing Hermione and Neville to laugh loudly. What are you talking about? Riddle asked, suddenly becoming alarmed. What do you mean Gryffindor in Slytherin robes? My friend Godric Gryffindor. Salazar admitted. Why don't you tell him, Hermione? Tell him what you figured out about Godric's name. Her eyes became wider than galleons, and she and Neville stared at him. How did you? Blaise told us. Salazar said with a smile. Tell him. Harry's friend Gordy Roffin isn't who he says he is, she said, glaring at Riddle. Gordy Sigdroffin is an anagram for Godric Gryffindor. Riddle seemed to think about it for a moment, but then he glared at her and Salazar. The anagram may be true, but I don't believe you. He snarled. Then he turned to Salazar. Where is my diary, Potter? Oh, I have your diary right here, Tom. Salazar said with a chuckle, as he took it out of his pocket. Don't call me that, and give it to me now, he demanded, glaring at Salazar in a way that reminded the old wizard of Draco's tantrums. Salazar just chuckled again and shook his head. No, I don't think I will, he said, standing there facing Riddle with an amused smirk on his face. Riddle glared at him with cold dark eyes. Do you know who I am, Potter? Riddle asked coldly. Because I don't think you do. I am not a common ordinary Slytherin. I am Lord Voldemort. I heard you the first time, Salazar said with a sigh. You may be Lord Voldemort, but to me you are nothing more than a child throwing a temper tantrum. I am stronger, faster, and a whole lot more knowledgeable in the dark arts than you ever will be. Your actions thus far have actually been quite comical, and I do not find you threatening at all. I have your mudblood and blood traitor friend tied up, and this pathetic little boy is almost dead, Riddle said, as he paced back and forth like a caged cat. And as for your knowledge, I have been able to create a Horcrux, the darkest form of magic, at the age of 15. You are no match for me, Potter. He spat. It doesn't matter what you say, Riddle, or Voldemort, or whatever your name happens to be. Point is, you're a non-issue, because not only is Gordy Godric Gryffindor, but Harry is Salazar Slytherin himself. Hermione stated in a matter-of-fact tone. A very true statement, Hermione, Salazar said with a nod. Riddle screamed with rage at being treated so nonchalantly, and he glared at everyone. Lies. All lies, he bellowed. Have it your way, Potter. Let's see if Gryffindor's heir can outmatch Slytherin's basilisk, Riddle cried. Then he turned to the statue. Speak to me, Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four. As the statue began opening its mouth, Salazar looked over at Hermione and Neville, who looked slightly amused by Riddle's last trump card being played, but Salazar blinked, and suddenly they were blindfolded. They tensed up for several seconds, but then they relaxed and he saw them smile. He knew one of the others had warned and blindfolded them as a precaution. Riddle turned back towards Salazar with a smug look on his face, but Salazar just stood there shaking his head. "Shake your head all you want, Potter," Riddle yelled gleefully. "Parseltongue won't save you now, it only obeys me. Now get on your knees and tremble in fear." Salazar sighed loudly and chuckled as Hermione and Neville burst out laughing. Again. He closed his eyes when Emeralda's nose appeared. He heard her slither out of the statue, and the chamber trembled slightly when the full weight of her body hit the floor. Is that the shrew?" Nora suddenly yelled. "Fish bait," Emeralda hissed loudly. "Come here, you squirmy little worm, so I can devour you properly." "Speaker, don't let her eat me," Nora shouted frantically. "Nora, come to me if you want. I won't let her eat you," Neville said with a chuckle. "No thanks, Bottom. I'll just stay here with Speaker," she answered, tightening her grip around Salazar's forearm. All right. Enough of this," Salazar chuckled. "I swear, Salazar, it's like watching a mall comedy program." Godric laughed, suddenly appearing beside the children. "That boy is truly pathetic." "Indeed," Merlin said, as he and Nicholas both appeared. "But we need to hurry up and stop playing games, Salazar. Mr. Weasley is fading fast," he added, as he untied Hermione and Neville, who stood up with help from Nicholas. Salazar nodded, and turned to Emeralda, who had her head turned away from them. "Emeralda, would you be so kind as to bite this blasted book? We really need to get rid of it." "Of course, Master, but what of the arrogant little boy? He will die when you bite the book. He is tied to it, and when he dies, Ron will be just fine." "I understand, Master. Let me know when you are ready." "What is happening here?" Riddle shouted angrily. "This is not how this is supposed to go." "We told you already. He is Salazar Slytherin, and you are hardly a threat to anyone at this point. We are not scared of you, no matter how much you want us to be," Neville said gleefully. "Shut up, you filthy blood traitor. It is lies. All lies. I am Salazar Slytherin, but I am polyjuiced to look like Harry Potter," he said, and watched with amusement as Riddle stared at him in shocked disbelief as reality over the situation finally began to sink in. Riddle seemed to finally take a good look around and noticed that Godric, Nicholas, and Merlin was standing there glaring back at him. "I knew it had to be Polyjuice," Neville cried. "I'll tell you children the whole story later, but for now, let's just get you out of this chamber. Nicholas, you will have to secure their minds, if you don't mind." "Of course, Salazar, I'd be happy to," he replied. "Are you going to erase our memories?" Hermione asked with a little whimper. "No, Miss Granger, I won't," Nicholas said. "What I will do will cause you no pain, and you will remember everything." "Oh good," Neville said with a sigh of relief. "Hey, can I ask a question? Mr. Nilrem, are you really the actual Merlin?" he asked, curiously. "You are a very smart wizard, Mr. Longbottom," Merlin said with a chuckle. "Yes, I am the Merlin." "Hermione figured it out," Neville said with a grin. "How? But how?" Riddle asked, staring at him in shock. "Horcruxes are not the only way to live forever, Tom," Salazar said with a sigh. "But you are too young and too arrogant to realize that." "Nilrem is Merlin spelled backwards," Hermione admitted with a blush. "We will talk about it later, let's just get this book destroyed," Salazar said with a chuckle. Then he turned to Emeralda. "My dear, open your mouth and I will place this book on one of your teeth. When I tell you to, bite down hard." "Of course, Master," she replied, and opened her mouth wide. No, don't. Please. I can learn from you. Please. Please," Riddle shouted, as he tried to run towards Salazar. "I will not sacrifice Run to save you, Tom, so forget it. You are evil and need to be destroyed," Salazar said coldly, as he placed the diary on top of Emeralda's tooth. "Now my dear." She bit down hard and an unearthly scream filled the chamber as the memory of Tom Riddle exploded and disappeared. Ron yelped slightly as the last shards of the memory faded from view, and he sat up abruptly. "What is going on?" Salazar suddenly shouted, and drew his bleeding hand towards his chest. "Master. Speaker. Harry. Get them out. Get them out," Salazar shouted, as he stumbled towards Godric. "I nicked my hand on her tooth. Get them out." He threw the blackened diary towards Nicholas, and told him to give it to Albus as Nicholas began ushering the now frightened children out of the chamber. Godric laid the sweating and bleeding Salazar on the chamber floor, but gripped his non-wounded hand tightly. "Hold on, my friend. I'll call for Nahum. We will get you sorted out with his tears." "No," Merlin said gently, kneeling down beside him. "Salazar, the polyjuice rock has been ready for the past month. Just let the venom work through your system. When it reaches your head, it will destroy the Horcrux." "Two birds, one stone," Salazar whispered. Then he screamed again and began convulsing violently. Godric firmly held his hand, and tears flowed down his face as he helplessly watched Salazar scream, writhe, and convulse with great waves of pain. To him, it seemed like hours, but in reality it was only a few minutes. When the venom had circulated throughout his system and reached his head, Salazar let off one more scream of pain before a smoky black mass erupted out of his head. The unearthly wail of the soul piece filled the room alongside Salazar's screams, but it faded quickly away. Right before their eyes Salazar began to change. Godric's breath hitched in his throat when Salazar's true form lay in front of him, and he smiled as he finally looked into the face of his best friend. Salazar was bald, but he had a white mustache, which connected with a goatee that came to a sharp point just below his chin. His gray eyes were open, but he stared unblinking at the ceiling above them. The now red and swollen lightning bolt scar on his forehead was the only thing that remained the same in his appearance. "Welcome back, Salazar," he whispered as Salazar lay still and quiet on the floor. "Godric, call for Nahum," Merlin said softly. "Ask him for some tears, then ask him if he would be willing to transport me home so I can get the polyjuice rock and come back." Godric did, and when Nahum arrived, he gladly gave up a few tears, which were dropped right into Salazar's mouth. Then he took Merlin home. Godric waited with bated breath in the silent chamber, with the only sound being Nora and Emeralda's heavy breathing. When Salazar began to stir, Godric grinned broadly at his longtime friend. "You do realize you're bald, right? When I last saw you at my funeral, you had hair." Salazar blinked a few times, and seemed to look around to get his bearings, but then he grinned at Godric. "Witches seem to like it. Please tell me it worked and that I don't have to do that again." "It did, you bald-headed fool," Godric said, wiping tears off his cheeks. "Godric, are you crying?" "Of course not," he scoffed, helping Salazar to his feet. "It is rather dusty down here, you know. Keep this blanket wrapped around you. We had to vanish your clothes when you changed." "Peaky." "Master called for Peaky?" the little elf said, appearing with a small crack. The elf's eyes widened as he looked around the chamber and spotted Emeralda, but Godric chuckled. "Everything's all right, so don't be alarmed. Will you please pop into Salazar's dorm and fetch him some clothes? He will need them when he changes back. Also, tell Blaze, if he is alone, that everything is all right and we will talk to him later." "Of course, Master," he said with a slight bow, and popped away. "Oh, my joints are stiff, and it feels funny to walk around," Salazar said, sitting down on a nearby large rock. "Emeralda, are you all right? Nora, where are you?" "Master, I thought I killed you. Are you sure you're all right?" "Speaker, Don't ever do that again. You scared me silly. I had to leave you because you changed so suddenly. Salazar chuckled. I am all right, my dears. I assure you, he said, getting up and trying to walk around a bit more. A few minutes later Merlin appeared, as Peaky popped back in. Peaky said Blaze felt better knowing everything was all right, and handed Godric Salazar's clothes before popping away again. Merlin asked how he was feeling and Salazar said he felt fine, other than his stiff joints. And your head? Merlin asked, peering at the scar. It feels fine. Better actually, he said with a sigh. Is the scar still there? It is, and it will be there forever. It's a dark scar, Salazar. You know they can't be gotten rid of, or covered up by using magic. True, he answered with a nod. We must get back to the main part of the castle. No doubt Minerva is in a right state, along with everyone else, Merlin said, handing him the tiny black polyjuice rock. I find it best if you place it in the crook of your arm, behind your elbow. It hurts the least there, and it's easily accessible, Godric advised. Salazar nodded and cut his arm using his wand. He placed the rock in the crook of his arm, and they watched as he turned into a much bigger copy of his former Harry Potter self. I had hoped we could do this over the summer, so we could use the excuse of eating right and a growth spurt, Merlin said with a frown. But I guess using Phoenix tears as a scapegoat will work just fine. Salazar and Godric laughed as Salazar quickly changed into his clothes, though he had to enlarge them so that they would fit somewhat properly. Then they said goodbye to Emeralda, who went back to the statue, and scooped up Nora before heading up to the main part of the castle. When they reached the hospital wing, Salazar found himself engulfed in the arms of a very thankful Molly Weasley. As soon as she let him go, Poppy scolded him about playing with giant dangerous snakes and made Salazar climb into a bed, much to the amusement of Merlin and Nicholas. Albus was sitting in a chair with the blackened diary in his lap, and glaring at everyone. He eyed Salazar curiously and took in his bigger frame, then stood to make his way over to them. Harry, what happened down in the chamber? He asked in his best grandfatherly tone. I've only been told bits and pieces, he added as he glared at Nicholas. Everyone in the room suddenly became quiet and glanced at Salazar, who looked up and smiled at Albus, which seemed to shock the headmaster. Well, I'll tell you, he said happily, and Minerva snorted. Hush Minerva, this ought to be good, Poppy scolded, leaning in towards Salazar with a grin. Salazar really wanted to kiss the two witches, and vowed to do so sometime during the summer now that he had his normal form back. When Mr. Nilrem, Mr. Flamel, Cordy, and I entered the chamber, we found Ron out cold, and Hermione and Neville tied up with ropes Voldemort had conjured using Ron's wand. After I summoned an elf, Voldemort and I had some tea and biscuits and talked about taking over the world, he said nonchalantly, while taking a sip of water from a glass Poppy had handed him. Then he continued. It was agreeable to both of us, but unfortunately I'm a Dark Lord that works alone, so I killed him when his back was turned. He was an awfully nice fellow though, he said with a large grin, then he glared at the Albus. This could have been prevented if you had just given us the diary in the first place, he shouted suddenly. Albus glared at him and Ron looked at him with a horrified expression, but everyone else started laughing. Except Severus. Potter, you will speak to the headmaster in a proper manner, he exclaimed. Harry, I don't appreciate your tone. Now tell me what really happened, Albus said sharply. Salazar went on to tell him what happened, though he altered the events a great deal, but Albus seemed satisfied with what he had been told. Salazar learned how Hermione and Neville ended up in the chamber. Apparently Ron had attacked them in one of the corridors, stunned them, and dragged them into the chamber. Ron kept apologizing over and over and asked if he was in trouble, but Albus and his parents assured him he wasn't. Albus looked Salazar over and commented on his new appearance. He asked Salazar how it happened, but Salazar just shrugged his shoulders and said the change happened after he ingested the phoenix tears offered by Nahum. Merlin spoke up and said the phoenix tears likely reversed the effects of the abuse Salazar had suffered from the Dursleys for 10 years. This caused Albus to glare mutinously at Merlin, and then the headmaster stomped out of the room. Poppy began her second round of examinations after that. She gave Ron a dreamless sleep potion, and Severus left to go get Blaise so that Nicholas could secure children's minds. Salazar told the children that he was slightly angry with them for not telling him that they knew, but in all honesty, he couldn't fault them. He and Godric hadn't exactly been careful with some of the things they said and did, and he was actually surprised that they hadn't figured it out long before they had. He was more angry with himself than he was with them. Salazar did let everyone know that the basilisk venom had worked, and said now that he had his normal form back, and the Horcrux out of his head, he felt loads better than he had in a long time. This eased Poppy's mind greatly and she insisted that he allow her to perform detailed scans and diagnostics tests to be sure. He allowed her to without much fuss. It was late when they all finally fell asleep in the hospital wing. Molly and Arthur stayed, since all of their children, except Ginny who had been sent back to her dorm when Ron was brought in, were in the hospital wing. Neville, Hermione, Blaise, and Godric were sent back to their houses, but promised to return first thing the next morning. Salazar fell asleep that night with a satisfied smile on his face. Sirius showed up the next morning because he had heard what happened and was concerned about his godson. He let Albus have an earful about not giving the diary up sooner and thought about pressing charges against Albus for neglect, until Remus talked some sense into him at Albus's request. Albus wasn't seen much that day, but everyone guessed he was avoiding Molly, who had been so distraught the night before that she couldn't think straight. That morning however, she was rearing to go. Poppy offered her some howler paper, and Molly finally got to vent her frustrations. The howler could be heard all throughout Hogwarts. Dobby showed up to check in and see if everyone was all right, though the little elf had bandages wrapped around his hands and feet, and it looked like he had been kicked into a wall several times. When Salazar asked him what happened, Dobby told him that he got caught listening to his family's conversations and was punished for it. Merlin got very angry at that, and talked Dobby into taking him to Malfoy Manor. When they got back, Dobby flung himself at Salazar's feet and pledged to serve only Mr. Harry Salazar Potter Slytherin, sir. Merlin told everyone that he had obliterated Dobby's existence from Lucius and Narcissa's minds, thereby keeping Dobby alive, seeing as the bond between the Malfoys and Dobby had not been officially broken. Salazar said he would take care of Draco later with a confundus charm, and asked Nicholas not to mention anything about it to Perenelle. Nicholas just laughed. The rest of the year passed somewhat smoothly after that. Albus avoided Salazar, but tried his hardest to convince Hermione, Neville, and Blaise that there was something wrong with Harry and they needed to avoid him. They brushed him off, much to Albus's displeasure. Albus didn't really know what to do with Gordy Ruffin though. He wanted to believe the young Slytherin lad was dark, but the boy was bonded to a phoenix. Albus was at a total loss about that, and decided to keep a close eye on him. Ron was soon back to his old self, though Arthur asked Merlin to come by the burrow in order to check on him and Ginny at the start of the summer, to which Merlin agreed. Ron still didn't like the two slimy Slytherins, but he did say that maybe Potter wasn't so bad after all, seeing as he had saved him from you-know-who. This gave Salazar a small glimmer of hope for the boy. Exams came and went and everyone once again received at least an A or above, thanks to Salazar and Godric's study groups for both years. Colin and Luna had joined Godric's, along with several other first years, and both founders were proud that all of the children had done so well. On the last day of school, Salazar was called to Albus's office an hour before the train was to depart. He sighed as he glared at the door in front of him, and knocked. "Come in," Albus called out loudly. Salazar walked in and sat in one of the chairs Albus motioned towards. He was immediately on his guard when he realized that on one but the two of them were in the room. "You wanted to see me, headmaster?" Salazar asked innocently. "Yes, Harry. I called you in here to inquire about your living arrangements this summer," Albus said, leaning back in his chair. Salazar raised an eyebrow and gave the headmaster a calculating gaze. "Well, sir, as you know, I'll be living with Sirius this summer. He has bought a house, though he won't tell me where it is yet. He says it is a surprise." "Yes, about that. I don't think you should live with Sirius. I believe that he is not the best person to raise a child right now, seeing he has only been out of Azkaban a short while." Salazar refrained from rolling his eyes, but he did chuckle a bit. "Sirius knows that, which is why Mr. and Mrs. Flamel have agreed to help him and me to adjust, so it won't only be the two of us." "I see," Albus said. "I thought as much, but Harry, I'm afraid I must insist in other arrangements. I'm afraid you will have to go back to the Dursleys." "Why?" Salazar asked in disbelief. He knew the Bloodwards had fallen, so there was no need for him to go back there. Not that the Bloodwards were of any use to him to begin with. "Because I just need you to," Albus stated. Salazar narrowed his eyes and tightened his grip on the wand that was in his pocket. "I'm afraid that is not going to happen, headmaster. I'll be going now, and I will certainly be letting everyone know about this conversation," he said, and stood up to make his way to the door. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to do that, Harry," Albus said, and he jumped out of his seat with surprising speed. Salazar turned back towards him in just enough time to see Albus brandish his wand. "Oblivat!" With a flick of his wandless hand, Salazar disarmed Albus, then he brought his wand up and cried, "Stupefy!" Albus's wand skittered across the floor and he fell over backwards and slumped in his chair. The old headmaster's portraits were in an uproar, and many of them, including Phineas Black, were outright cursing him, but Salazar paid them no mind. He was fuming. He picked up Albus's wand and snapped it in half. Then he quickly scribbled a note, laid the broken wand on top of it, and left. When Minerva revived him later that day after the train had left, Albus stared at the broken wand in horror, and read the note with shaking hands. "If you ever try to obliviate me again, something much worse than a broken wand will happen to you. Have a pleasant summer. Sincerely, Harry James Potter."
Hello everyone, I am Nat1995 here with a small announcement for the video game fanfic plot. I know in every ending of videos there is a small announcement that I will take requests for any fanfic or video game. That will stop right now. I have too much videos that I need to complete. There's sequels that need to be put up. I am sorry. For any requests that people suggested will be put on the back burner until I completed my videos. I even made a list of videos that needed to be completed. I am so sorry about that. Until next time, I am Nat1995, signing off.